Welcome, traveler of time. You've entered a realm where kings rise, empires fall, and every crown carries a curse. Today, we journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating monarchs, where love, power, and destiny intertwine. The year is 1455. England lies not in the triumphant peace of a kingdom united, but under a heavy, unstable blanket of cold dread. We stand on the precipice of a dynastic conflict so vicious, so steeped in betrayal and blood, that would not be a single war, but a sprawling, 30-year saga of family against family, house against house. This cataclysmic period, known to history as the War of the Roses conflict, was a savage quarrel over the right to wear the English crown, fracturing the mighty Plantagenet legacy into 1,000 bloody pieces. At the heart of this crumbling realm sits a king, Henry VI. Not a warrior, not a tyrant, but a devout, gentle, and utterly ineffective soul. His father, the legendary Henry V, had conquered France and secured the allegiance of an entire nation. His son, Henry VI, inherited only the ghosts of that glory. He was a man more suited to the quiet contemplation of a monastery than the cutthroat brutality of the royal court. When the pressures of governing became too great, the king would simply withdraw, suffering from bouts of total mental collapse, often leaving him speechless, blank-eyed, and unable to recognize his own wife or son. His wife was the formidable Queen Margaret of Anjou, a French princess, fierce, intelligent, and utterly devoted to securing the succession for her son, the Prince of Wales. She saw the weakness of her husband and resolved to rule for him, but her foreign origins and iron will only deepen the resentment of the English nobility. The man who capitalized on this royal void was Richard, Duke of York. A cousin to Henry VI, he was a massive landowner, a decorated military commander, and, crucially, a direct descendant of two of the four sons of the long-dead King Edward III. His claim to the throne, though technically subordinate to Henry's, was arguably stronger in the eyes of many powerful barons who craved a return to strong, decisive leadership. The rivalry began innocently enough, a simple power struggle over who should act as regent during the king's fits of madness. Should it be the queen and her Lancastrian clique, who used the royal seal to enrich themselves? Or should it be the competent, yet deeply ambitious, Duke of York? This argument, this administrative quarrel over a protectorate, was the slow-burning fuse. The symbols of these two warring factions were as beautiful as the conflict was ugly. For the king and queen, the House of Lancaster, it was the deep, velvety red rose. For the Duke and his supporters, the House of York, it was the pure, proud white rose. The great question that hangs over this period, the mystery that defines every ambush, every execution, and every betrayal, is this: how could a simple argument over a crown shatter a nation for 3 decades and devour its noblest families whole? The answer lies in the unique nature of the English peerage, a small, interconnected web of powerful families, all related by blood, all jostling for control over a single, fragile prize. When the king proved unable to maintain order, the nobility didn't just stand by. They chose sides, dragging their vast retinues, their family feuds, and their thousands of armed men onto the battlefields. The War of the Roses conflict was inevitable precisely because the stakes were zero-sum. It wasn't about land or taxation. It was about the absolute right to rule. If you backed the losing side, your lands were forfeit, your titles were stripped, and often, your head was taken. The fear of being annihilated by the rival faction drove the participants to extremes of violence and mistrust. The only path to safety was the complete destruction of the opposing house. The very definition of treason was about to become the most fluid, dangerous, and frequently changing concept in the English language. The stage was set. The king was weak. The queen was ruthless. The duke was ambitious. And the symbol of a unified nation was about to be torn apart, piece by bloody piece, under the banner of 2 innocent flowers. The first blow was struck not in a grand siege or a naval assault, but in the streets of St. Albans in 1455. It was a skirmish, an administrative tangle that escalated instantly into bloodshed. Richard of York, marching on London under the flimsy pretense of removing the king's bad counselors, was met by a nervous royal force. The fighting was messy, brutal, and short. But the outcome was definitive. The Lancastrian leader was killed, and King Henry VI, finding himself utterly defenseless, became a literal captive in his own kingdom. York now held the power he craved. He forced the now sane Henry VI to reappoint him as protector. He had won the first round of the War of the Roses conflict, but his victory was a fatal error. He had crossed the line from powerful nobleman to regicidal traitor. He had drawn first blood, and the cost would be measured in generations. The true energy of the Lancastrian cause now solidified around Queen Margaret. With Henry VI a captive and later a fragile figurehead, Margaret became the general, the politician, the very soul of the Red Rose. She spent the next years tirelessly gathering allies and armies, moving with her young son across the north of England, using the immense wealth and loyalty of the ancient northern barons to her cause. Her motivation was primal, protecting her son's birthright. She would tolerate no compromise, no treaty, no mercy. The Yorkist mythos, meanwhile, found its champion in a man who would become arguably the most powerful subject in English history, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. A formidable and obscenely wealthy magnate, Warwick was York's strongest ally. He was a brilliant commander and politician, a master of propaganda who could raise armies with a single word. His sheer influence earned him the moniker that would define him, the Kingmaker. The conflict began to escalate beyond recognition. Battles followed skirmishes, each one more devastating. At the Battle of Blore Heath in 1459, the Lancastrian forces were shattered. But the following year, the Lancastrians counterattacked at Wakefield. Wakefield was a defining moment of savagery. Here, the formidable Queen Margaret won a crushing victory. But the greatest prize of the day was the man himself, Richard, Duke of York. York was cornered, captured, and summarily executed. His head, adorned with a paper crown and the red rose of Lancaster, was displayed on a pike above the city gates of York. The message was unmistakable. Treason would be repaid with indignity and death. The execution of York didn't end the war. It poured gasoline on the fire. It provided the Yorkist cause with something Henry VI's capture could not: a martyr. York's son, the young, handsome, and fiercely capable Edward, Earl of March, now inherited his father's titles, lands, and, crucially, his claim to the throne. Edward IV was everything Henry VI was not: tall, charismatic, physically powerful, and a brilliant military leader. Margaret, meanwhile, made her own catastrophic mistake. After Wakefield, her northern army, fueled by vengeance and the promise of plunder, rampaged south, pillaging and destroying everything in its path. This terrified the wealthy, powerful citizens of London. They saw not a liberating army, but a horde of vengeful barbarians. When Edward, supported by Warwick the Kingmaker, marched towards London, the city gates opened wide. Edward, riding into the capital as a savior, was immediately proclaimed King Edward IV in 1461. The old, mad, gentle King Henry VI was officially deposed. The struggle now moved to the north for the final, brutal confrontation of this phase, the Battle of Towton. Fought during a swirling snowstorm on Palm Sunday 1461, it was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Over 50,000 men engaged in a 7-hour massacre. The cold, the relentless snow, and the sheer desperation ensured no quarter was given. The Lancastrians were utterly crushed. Tens of thousands died. Queen Margaret and the young Prince of Wales fled into exile, seeking aid from their French kinsmen. Edward IV, victorious and bloody, consolidated his hold on the throne. The White Rose had triumphed. Edward IV reigned, and the Kingmaker, Warwick, stood beside him, the architect of his victory. The War of the Roses conflict seemed, for a brief, deceptive moment, to be over. But Warwick's creation would soon be his master, and that master would prove far more dangerous than the Kingmaker ever imagined. The early reign of King Edward IV was the golden age of York. England had stability, its treasury was slowly filling, and the charismatic young king was a capable administrator and a formidable presence. But the very man who put him there, Warwick the Kingmaker, held too much power. Warwick had assumed his reward would be continued control over the state, especially concerning the king's marriage. Warwick's grand strategy was to secure an alliance with France through a marriage treaty for Edward. But Edward, young and reckless, had other ideas. In a move that shocked and infuriated Warwick, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a woman with no title, no dowry, and, worst of all in Warwick's eyes, a large family of ambitious Lancastrian relations. This marriage was not just an act of love. It was a political earthquake. It humiliated Warwick publicly, torpedoing his diplomatic plans and placing a rival faction, the numerous, grasping Woodville family, at the very heart of the New Yorkist court. The rift between king and kingmaker became a chasm. Warwick, seeing his immense influence draining away to the Woodvilles, felt betrayed and slighted. The man who had destroyed the Lancastrians now contemplated destroying the Yorkist king he had created. Warwick's next move was astonishing, even for the twisted politics of the War of the Roses conflict. He allied himself with the king's own disgruntled younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and then, in the ultimate act of historical irony, he sailed to France. There, he met with the exiled Queen Margaret of Anjou, the woman he had fought tooth and nail to depose, the woman who had executed his father and brother. The French king, Louis XI, the universal spider, brokered an impossible peace. Warwick agreed to restore the mad Henry VI to the throne, and Margaret agreed to forgive Warwick's treason. To seal this bizarre, desperate alliance, Margaret's son, the Prince of Wales, was married to Warwick's daughter. Warwick returned to England in 1470, executing a stunning political coup known as the Readaptation, the taking back of the crown. Edward IV, completely blindsided by the scale of the betrayal, was forced to flee, escaping with a handful of loyal followers and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Old King Henry VI was dragged out of the Tower of London, where he had been quietly living in captivity, and placed back on the throne. The Red Rose, for a fleeting 7 months, bloomed again, but this was a hollow victory. The War of the Roses conflict was far from over. Edward IV, backed by his loyal brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and crucially, aided by money and men from Burgundy, returned to England in 1471. The final brutal showdowns of this middle phase were at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. At Barnet, Warwick the Kingmaker met his destiny. The battle was fought in a heavy fog. Chaos reigned. Warwick, betrayed by his own ally, Clarence, who switched sides back to his brother Edward IV, was killed. The man who had deposed 2 kings and restored a third was now dead, his body ignominiously stripped and put on public display in London to prove the Kingmaker's demise. Weeks later, at Tewkesbury, Edward IV cornered the returning Lancastrian army, led by Queen Margaret and her son. The Yorkist forces were utterly merciless. The Lancastrians were destroyed. Margaret's only son, the Prince of Wales and the last hope of the main Lancastrian line, was killed, possibly executed immediately after the battle. Margaret was captured and taken prisoner. The following month, the gentle, mad, twice-deposed King Henry VI, the last Lancastrian king, was found dead in the Tower of London. His death was conveniently declared natural, but history has little doubt that his ambitious cousin, Edward IV, ensured the end of the main Lancastrian line once and for all. Edward IV reigned supreme. The White Rose was secured through blood and fire, but the instability caused by the War of the Roses conflict had irrevocably poisoned the rules of succession. The precedent was set. The crown could be taken by force, and blood was no longer a shield against ambition. Edward IV had defeated his enemies, but he had failed to defeat the inherent violence within his own house. That internal rot would soon destroy his legacy. For 12 years, Edward IV held the throne with ruthless efficiency. The War of the Roses conflict appeared to have subsided, but its true danger lay not in the old Lancastrian embers, but in the brittle structure of the Yorkist dynasty itself. In 1483, Edward IV, still a young man, died suddenly. The realm was plunged into immediate crisis. Edward's heir was his 12-year-old son, Edward V. The dying king had appointed his universally respected younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector for the young prince. Richard was a proven, loyal commander who had stood by Edward IV through every phase of the Civil War. He was seen as the strongest man in the realm, perfectly suited to guide the young king. But within weeks, the deep-seated mistrust planted by the previous decades of conflict poisoned the new regime. Richard quickly moved to secure the young king and his 9-year-old brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. He housed them in the relative safety and prestige of the Tower of London, ostensibly to prepare the young king for his coronation. But Richard also moved decisively against the powerful Woodville family, the late Queen Elizabeth and her relatives, accusing them of plotting to seize control of the young king. The arrests were swift and brutal. The protectorate rapidly descended into a coup. Richard, urged on by old Yorkist loyalists who deeply resented the Woodvilles, began to question the legitimacy of his late brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. It was argued that Edward IV had already been secretly contracted to another woman before marrying Elizabeth, rendering the Woodville marriage bigamous and the children illegitimate. Whether Richard genuinely believed this claim, or whether it was a calculated power grab, remains the greatest mystery of this entire dynastic struggle. On June 26, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was officially declared the rightful king of England, bypassing his young nephew. He was crowned King Richard III. The fate of the young King Edward V and his brother, the princes in the Tower, is perhaps the most haunting tragedy of the English monarchy. Shortly after Richard III's coronation, the boys vanished. They were last seen playing in the gardens of the Tower. They were never seen again. History has almost universally laid their murder at the feet of their ambitious uncle, Richard III, marking him as the cruelest villain in the entire War of the Roses conflict. Richard III secured the crown, but he paid for it with his reputation and the loyalty of the nation. His reign was plagued by plots and rebellions. The sheer audacity and ruthlessness of deposing and allegedly murdering his nephew's alienated key Yorkist supporters. These disaffected nobles soon rallied around the only surviving, credible focus for opposition, a distant Lancastrian claimant living in exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Henry Tudor was the son of a distant Lancastrian line, a man who had spent most of his life in exile. His claim to the throne was tenuous at best, but the nation was weary of bloodshed and scandal. Henry Tudor offered something no one else could: an end to the War of the Roses conflict through unity. He promised that if he won, he would marry the eldest surviving daughter of the late Edward IV, Elizabeth of York, thus uniting the Red Rose and the White Rose. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small force of mercenaries and exiles. He marched quickly into England, gathering support from those disgusted by Richard III's rule. The final act of this epic dynastic struggle was fought at the Battle of Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard III, fully armored and wearing the crown into battle, faced Henry Tudor. The battle hung in the balance, decided by the last, unforgivable betrayal. The massive Stanley family, whose loyalties had been ambiguous, threw their weight behind Henry Tudor at the crucial moment. Richard III, a true warrior, saw his lines crumbling. Refusing to flee, he charged directly towards Henry Tudor, intending to end the war with a single sword stroke. He fell short. Richard III was killed in the chaos, his body ignominiously stripped and abused. The crown, knocked from his head during the fighting, was recovered from a thorn bush and placed upon the head of Henry Tudor. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England for over 3 centuries, was over. The War of the Roses conflict had found its bloody conclusion on the field of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth Field was more than just the end of skirmish. It was the birth of a new era. Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, was acutely aware that his throne was won by battle, not by clear hereditary right. He knew, better than anyone, that the only way to heal the deep, festering wounds of the War of the Roses conflict was through consolidation and symbolism. He fulfilled his promise. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This union was the ultimate peace treaty, bringing together the surviving bloodlines of the rival houses. Out of this sacred bond, a new emblem was born. The Tudor rose, a flower of deep red, quartered with the white of York. It was a potent symbol of national unity, declaring that the Civil War was finally, definitively over. Henry VII spent his reign meticulously dismantling the political machinery that had fueled the decades of fighting. He restricted the noble family's ability to raise private armies, known as livery and maintenance, and relied instead on non-noble, competent administrators to govern. He was a cautious, meticulous, and brilliant ruler who understood that stability was the only true measure of success. The peace he forged was paid for by the bloodshed of his predecessors. The legacy of the War of the Roses conflict is complex and haunting. It killed off a huge percentage of the ancient nobility, effectively ending the medieval power structure and paving the way for the centralized, absolute power of the Tudor monarchy. The Civil War shattered trust, established the terrifying precedent that a king could be deposed and executed, and taught every noble house that survival depended on utter ruthlessness. But the conflict also gifted history one of its most enduring villains, Richard III. His story, particularly the suspected murder of his nephews, was seized upon by Tudor propagandists. Richard III was painted as a monstrous, hunchback tyrant who murdered his way to the throne. Though historical evidence for his deformity and his role in the prince's disappearance remains highly debated, the image crafted by Tudor spin doctors and later immortalized by William Shakespeare is the one that survived. The wicked, crown-stealing uncle. The victor writes the history, and Henry VII ensured his victory was total. The Wars of the Roses also gave birth to a powerful historical mystery. What happened to the princes in the Tower? Their vanishing remains an unsolved puzzle, a ghost story that haunts the very foundations of the British monarchy. Were they killed by Richard III? Or were they perhaps eliminated by Henry VII, who would have had good reason to remove all remaining Yorkist claimants? The truth is locked in the stone walls of the Tower, but the tragedy remains a vivid symbol of the brutality of the era. The greatest lesson of the War of the Roses conflict is one of cyclical violence and the danger of unchecked ambition. It started because the nobles refused to respect a fragile king, and it ended only when all those who had participated were either dead, exiled, or too exhausted to fight again. It was a self-consuming fire that raged for 30 years, proving that when the foundations of authority crumble, the family that rules is often the first to be devoured. Centuries later, the echoes of the War of the Roses, blood and betrayal still haunt the ruins of history. We are still drawn to the white rose and the red rose, to the intrigue of the kingmaker, and to the eternal question of the princes in the Tower. It is a story not just of kings and crowns, but of the human cost of ambition. If stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to like and subscribe. More untold tales of history await you.